start by offering my appropriate thanks here. It goes without saying, of course, that I'm thankful to be invited to this incredibly interesting forum here. I've been listening long distance in learning about the English Subject Center by means of correspondence, by browsing its past newsletters, by being interviewed by Nicole King in a wonderful interview experience. And I'm extremely curious about the blend of government interest, educators' interest, and student interest that comes through convergence in the English Subject Center. So I look forward to that very much. I should say as well that for Southern California, I thank you for the reminder that weather exists. And the last but not least, you know, there are not very many occasions for a man to be sanctioned to wear ornamental bracelets and jewelry. But since there is a memory stick in this, I now have the excuse, so thank you for the ornament. I want to begin today with two cases, concrete cases, of instances where pedagogy is crossed by Web 2.0 or perhaps crossed up by 2.0, depending on how you look at it here. This is a course that I taught just a little bit over a year ago. It's one of the first courses I ever taught completely in a wiki environment, in this case, an environment powered by the MediaWiki program, which also drives the Wikipedia private instance of it here. It's a course titled Creativity and Collaboration, a project on new modes of authorship. And the basic idea was that during the first half of the course, I led the students on a series of reading assignments, taking us from the era of the Romantics through that of contemporary business, software authoring, film production, and one of their main interests, music production as well, the paradigm of the band. We studied the transition or the rich intermix between the solo creator and the collaborative creator as a paradigm of knowledge production here. The students were encouraged and indeed asked to produce all their work in the wiki and to edit each other's work as well. They produced glossary definitions, they produced what we called objects for study, which meant any artifact or human being that seemed of relevance to them, they would write a brief little blurb about. They produced their papers in the forms of research reports on the site. They produced a bibliography for the class as well. It's a small group, and as you see from this picture, I think it's quite expressive of the fact that it is a class that banded together very well and used the wiki both as a register of their experience with this topic of creativity and collaboration and as the practicum for such creative collaboration as well here. I think it was a successful course. I gave them a lot of freedom, and this kind of course in a wiki environment demands that a professor give his students a lot of freedom. For example, one of the things I asked them to do was produce their own class biography pages. I did this rather late in the course, and in retrospect, if I had to do it again, and as I have been doing again in further courses since this time, I would ask the students to do this right away. It's not only a fine way for them to learn the wiki environment, but something magical happens when they create their own biography page. Despite appearances, this is actually one of the smartest and brightest students in the class. This is an ironic play on Southern California weather here. When they create a page like this, which mediates somehow between a professional profile page and a MySpace or Facebook type of page, they suddenly invest their identities in the course. It suddenly becomes their course and not just the professor's course. That's something that worked very well indeed. I was very happy with the kinds of reports and pages they produced. I told them to create narratives of their part of the topic, designed not just to impress me as a professor, but perhaps also their friends as well. And as you can see, they went on to photographs. They were quite inventive and quite interested in the task when you pitched the audience to them in that particular way. I was even free enough to allow them to say things about me that I would not normally have done in another kind of environment. So I was quite surprised to wake up one morning and see this land on the site. This class is composed of 12 brilliant students and a bright, intelligent, and physically breathtaking professor. So click on physically breathtaking here. So, what to say about this? Well, first of all, copyright infringement is the least of my worries. I'll leave it at that here. Think about that nightly. So as you see, I've given them quite a bit of freedom to experiment in this environment, and I think the course succeeded quite well. There was one facet of the course in particular, though, that I did not make me happy, in that I left thinking that I had left too free. In retrospect, I would have clamped down a bit earlier and policed the course a bit more firmly earlier. And I think you can get a sense of that if we go to the glossary page, or indeed any of the other research pages, and look at items like this. This, for example, is a brief blurb defining what fair use means. And as you'll see, there's a single reference for this piece of scholarship, a Wikipedia article. Or again, under the term functionalism, 2 Wikipedia articles. And so it goes through the site. There are some of these definitions that have no references other than 6 or 7 Wikipedia articles here. So I suppose the American answer, or at least the Californian answer to the question that was posed earlier, how many books do you expect to be reading in university? It's actually 0. As you may know, I'm not sure whether the timing is the same as in this country, but roughly about 1.5 years ago to 2 years ago, Wikipedia hit our undergraduates like one of those vast algae blooms in the ocean that suck all the oxygen out of the water, leaving everything extinct in its path. If the undergraduate mind is an ocean, there are vast stretches of it now in which nothing now lives but Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not just the first, but the last resource of knowledge. As a consequence, I set out immediately after that course last summer to draft an appropriate use policy for Wikipedia addressed to the student, which was picked up by the blogosphere and debated quite widely. Surprisingly so. I wasn't aware of the fact that there was so much interest in this topic at that time. About 2 months ago, I finally finalized the policy. It's online now in both a short version and a full version. And you might be able to predict what I would say as an educator about this, an educator who is at once disturbed by the Wikipedia syndrome, but not Luddite enough to say no entirely. What the policy says, in essence, is both no and yes, I want to have my cake and eat it too. So no, as in the case of any encyclopedia, Wikipedia is not appropriate as the primary or sole reference for anything that is central to an argument, complex or controversial. No, again, Wikipedia, because it is an online encyclopedia created by a by and large, unregulated and sometimes anonymous group of contributors, has special problems. There are revert wars, there are edit wars, there's vandalism, there's an instability of the knowledge base that you need to be aware of. But yes, in a qualified way, Wikipedia is an appropriate source for some extremely recent topics, especially in popular culture or technology, for which it provides the sole or best available synthetic, analytical, or historical discussion. So if you want to trace the history of controversy regarding the silicon transistor and who invented it, or again, Britney Spears' life, that's where you would go. And finally, yes again, students should feel free to consult Wikipedia as one of the most powerful instruments for opening knowledge that the internet has yet produced. But then the policeman in me, the cop, has the last word. But it is not a one-stop shop for reliable knowledge. This policy has been quite popular, to judge by the number of requests I've had by email and otherwise to cite it, to quote it, to put it in other class syllabi around the world, and so on. But nevertheless, it is not something I'm particularly proud of. It's something that leaves me, certainly, as an educator with a kind of sour taste in my mouth, because it brings out the worst side of me, the cop in me, rather than the educator. It's kind of a compromise solution. That yes, you should reach out through the internet to those vast shelves of knowledge out there, and in the moment the student reaches for the fattest, juiciest, plumpest resource there, like in a cookie jar, slap on the wrist, no. Don't choose that resource. Or again, this blog, no. Don't choose that as well. It's an unsatisfactory solution, I think, a temporary solution to the problem. Case number 2 is not mine. Case number 2, as reported in Business Week here, is that in April 27th of this year, the Dean of Duke's Business School had the unfortunate task of announcing that nearly 10% of the class of 2008 had been caught cheating on a take-home final examination here, which created a stir and a controversy, particularly because it was in an educational world that had to do with business. On the one hand, there are those who say, yes, we should use the new technologies to collaborate, to share. This, after all, is the contemporary style of learning. One of the professors at the Stanford University Design School says, for example, it would be impossible in our school to cheat. If you found somebody to help you write an exam, in our view, that's a sign of an inventive person who gets stuff done. If you found someone to do work for free who was committed to open source, we'd say, wow, that was smart. I'm sure there's an allusion here to Tom Sawyer and painting that big fence in the background here. But of course, from the educational establishment's perspective, at a certain point, slap on the wrist again. We encourage you to share, to collaborate, to experiment with all these new technologies and paradigms of knowledge, but in the final instance, leave your cell phone and your computer at the door, sit down and take that exam by yourself, solo. Suddenly revert to the paradigm of a monk locked in a cell, writing. Thou shalt be credentialed alone as an isolato. Again, a very unhappy circumstance. Those of you who have prosecuted plagiarism cases, I unfortunately had the duty of doing that just this last quarter at my university, will know that it leaves nobody happy, not the administrators, not the educator, and certainly not the student. This is an instance taken to the extreme of the kind of policing reactions that the educational establishment has been forced to take in the face of collaborative models of knowledge and the technologies that enable them, such as Web 2.0. This is a fabulous technological solution to plagiarism created by the computer science department at my university. It's called the Pairwise program. Students in large courses, when the professor signs up for the program, are obliged to turn in their papers in digital form. The papers are checked across the internet for correspondences, and they're checked across an ever-accumulating repository of past papers for that particular course as well. And you'll see the program is quite smart about picking up not just the kinds of obvious cut and paste plagiarisms that you might be able to detect manually by scanning through a document, but dispersed patterns of cut and paste, small particulate granular takings from other documents, and even more brilliantly, the program is able to ferret out not one or two pairs of collaborators in a cheating ring, but entire patterns in cyclical units, network cells, as it were, of cheaters of one sort or another. When I first saw this program documented, my response was again mixed. Yes, this is a fabulous solution, but I raised my hand and said, where's the educational function in this? Where are the FAQ pages answering the question what plagiarism is about? Where are the seminars that accompany this to tell students why plagiarism is bad, when in the business world we are telling people that collaboration and sharing of knowledge is good? Where is the appropriate, positive, proactive educational component to this policing act here? I use the word policing because this concept is increasingly important in the world of collaborative knowledge and the technologies that enable it, such as Web 2.0. And not just from the perspective of educators looking in on the outside at these new technologies, but increasingly from within the new technologies themselves by means of internal policing actions. So for example, this is from one of the Wikipedia policies pages. If one of the narratives that one can tell about Wikipedia is that it has suddenly taken off in terms of number of users, number of articles, and so on, so too, just as compelling a narrative is the fact that that acceleration of usage and of content has been accompanied by an ever thicker proliferation of rules and regulations, policies, and, well, really the word policy is a euphemism for policing actions in the background here. So the administrative power is granted now by a small number of bureaucrats and stewards who in turn have been granted their power by developers, and there's an entire regulatory apparatus if you look further into Wikipedia. It's not very long before you see that others have even firmer ideas about policing the Web 2.0 sphere. Larry Sanger, for example, one of the co-founders with Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia, has had a long-running dispute with the Wikipedia community, saying that they are not tough enough upon themselves as policemen of their own resources. Therefore, in the last year, he has started up what he calls his progressive fork of Wikipedia, meaning he has mirrored the entire content of Wikipedia in a new resource called the Citizendium, and imposed on top of the Citizendium an editing structure that has an actual policing force to it. In his language, the charter and rules will be enforced by constables. In time, an effective and fair legal system will be established. It will be made up of people who are mature, well-educated, possessed of something of a legal mind, with a record free of major infractions, respected by their peers, and clearly committed to the community charter. So, in our brave new world, to be an educator, you shall be legally trained and be free of serious infractions of one sort or another here. Even though, to his credit, again like myself, both yes and no, trying to be both despotic and enlightened about Web 2.0 at the same time, Larry Sanger is trying very hard to create a system that is benign in its totalitarianism here. For the most part, he says, editors will work in the system just as everyone else does, shoulder to shoulder with ordinary authors. Editors will not be able to direct work in a top-down fashion, or to squat on articles and prevent others from making any changes. It's going to be very interesting over the course of the next few years to see how or if this system of regulation develops and whether it can be successful. Those of you who know the history of early internet communities, such as the Moo communities, the chat rooms, various forums of different kind, will recognize here that the kinds of issues that Sanger declares is a kind of a complete regeneration of the ontogeny of the issue of self-governance on the web. How does the community learn to govern itself without becoming too authoritarian in the process here? Not that that worries others who have an even firmer notion of policing Web 2.0 in mind. If you don't know about this, this is a really interesting resource to look at. It was started in November by the son of Phyllis Schlafly, who's the well-known Republican activist, pundit, conservative, anti-feminist in the US, Phyllis Schlafly. Andy Schlafly looked around at the Wikipedia and said, this is too liberal, if not leftist, by far. For example, the Wikipedia declares that the age of the Earth is more than 10,000 years. So we'll start there. So he decided to create a resource called the Conservapedia. It only has about 8,000 articles right now. I don't think it will be a serious threat to Wikipedia, but it has a particular vision of the world, reinforced by a policy page, which is not just about more policing, but I would like to call it moral policing. So no, they do not have rules and appropriate use policies, they have commandments. Page. And note the disclaimer at the bottom as well. Posting of obscenity here is punishable by up to 10 years in jail under section 1470 of the US Code 18. Vandalism is punishable up to 10 years in jail. The IP addresses of vandals will be reported to authorities. That includes your employer and your local prosecutor. So where does that leave us? Unfortunately, it leaves all of us calling the authorities. Whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're an educator or a Wikipedian, we are all in one way or another finding our way in this new world of shared collaborative knowledge by looking for the appropriate authority or authorities behind it here. Now, once upon a time, to say that calling the cops amounted to calling the authorities would not have been a very interesting statement, it would have been tautological. What makes that statement interesting now is that the assumptions behind what a policing force does has changed. In the modern age of policing, a police force is presumed to have what Norbert Elias called a monopoly of violence, or a monopoly of force. They have the sole legitimate enforcement function in a society here. What's different now is that the context of authority has changed. There is no one, presumably in Web 2.0, who has a monopoly of violence or a monopoly of force or a monopoly of enforcement. We're in a new world of multiple authorities or centers of authority. And in that new context, the issue of policing and its equation with authority becomes very interesting. How do you police? That is to say, how do you develop an appropriate policy for knowledge in the world of Web 2.0? in a context of multiple centers of authority here. I once thought I knew what authority meant on the internet. A few years ago, I was still saying to my students, you know, as English majors, you need to learn web authoring because it's one of the most powerful ways of authoring and publishing yourself ever invented. You'd be crazy not to learn how to do this if you're interested in writing and reading and so on here. So I thought the web was about authority as authorship. Here's an author who may or may not need an editor to help mount a web page. In the early days of the web, you probably didn't actually need an editor other than yourself. You put the page up on the server, and then the server delivered it to the user, very much as if in a traditional print-based authoring and reading world. Thus, for example, my voiceless shuttle page, this is a screenshot from its first version in about 1994 or thereabouts, was backed up by code that I knew how to write myself. It looks very dense and complicated, but all it really is that you see on the screen here is a set of list items of one sort or another. I could have done this by hand if the machine would have let me here, very much like authoring a manuscript. However, even at the time, the scene was complicated by what I would like now to call Web 1.5, in which the act of authorship was not quite as direct. This is the data-based model of dynamic web pages, which was already popular before the year 2000 here. Here, the author does not write a page onto the web directly. Rather, the author uses a web form to submit data to a database, which is carefully designed as part of a system presided over by a technically sophisticated team of editors, programmers, and designers to serve up information on the fly to the user. So basically, those of you who know the data architecture in the background, it works roughly as follows. Information is submitted to a database. It is extracted from the database by middleware scripting codes of different kinds. ASP or PHP are common ones. And what the code does is to dump the information into hollow template pages carefully designed in such a way to be molds, as it were, for the information which will then appear on the user's screen. So in its second instantiation, my voiceless shuttle is now a database-driven site. And to put information into it, I use a data submission form which ports data into particular fields and tables in the database in the background. And then the machinery that I just outlined then does the actual work of creating the web page that the user sees. Now note here that this is already a problematic authority issue. This is not just a data architecture map I'm showing on the screen, but an authority topography or map as well here. Although it's not too far from the traditional mode of authorship, so that if I wanted, I could simply look at this as analogous to something like a professional act of authorship by which all of us in this room, presumably submit a manuscript to a publishing house, and then a team of editors, designers, and so on takes over to actually produce the final bound artifact here. Very comparable still to that older model of authorship and authority. Now look what happens with what they're calling Web 2.0. Lots of light bulbs went on people's heads with this data-based model of web authorship. As long as we are taking the trouble to create this elaborate machinery to serve up content input into the database by authors who need not know any code at all to do it, this is the aha moment. Why not open the floodgates so that not just a single author can contribute data to that resource, but multiple authors using those exact same templates in input forms or not, and so on. So that an author might create a blog, and then other authors might submit a comment or feedback or a trackback. Or an author might start an article on Wikipedia, and others might then contribute to that same article as well here. And thus it is that we have the data architecture that underlies blogs, social networking sites. This is a MySpace page. Folksonomical tagging, GIS tagging, as in Google Maps or the Google Earth communities, and of course Wikipedia itself. The really interesting issue now, however, is that the data architecture here makes very unclear what the topography of authority is in the background. Does the authority behind knowledge now lie in this cloud of sometimes anonymous authors dynamically contributing to the resource? Or does it lie instead in this ever more technically sophisticated group of editors, programmers, and designers who, by far the majority of them that I know, do not want that responsibility, and indeed for legal reasons cannot have that authority, because then they would be liable if there were obscene or defamatory content on the site here. What I'm indicating, in other words, is that in the data architecture of Web 2.0, there's no natural locus for the authority to be centered. We're not comfortable with the authority in this cloud of authors out here, nor we are comfortable with situating authority in the technical people who are presiding over the system. It's kind of a vacuum of authority. So who should be the authority in the age of Web 2.0? I'll give you two of the most intelligent spokesmen on this issue from different sides. On one side, this is Tim O'Reilly, who's the most influential booster, you might call him, a promoter of the idea of Web 2.0, who in his well-known essay, What is Web 2.0, says in essence the authority should be everyone. There should be a kind of a cloud or diffuse authority. Web 2.0 is a system without an owner, tied together by a set of protocols, open standards, and agreements for cooperation. Users must be treated as co-developers. Like Wikipedia, blogging harnesses collective intelligence as a kind of filter. What James Surowiecki calls the wisdom of crowds comes into play. And on the other hand, Jaron Lanier, who, as you may know, is the inventor of the term and much of the technology for virtual reality. Not a Luddite by any means, so when someone like this says what I'm about to synopsize here, one tends to sit up and listen. Jaron, in an article titled Digital Maoism, writes, "History has shown us again and again that a hive mind is a cruel idiot when it runs on autopilot. Nasty hive mind outbursts have been flavored Maoist, fascist, and religious." So he's saying there's something wrong with the notion of collective authority, with that cloud authority that Tim O'Reilly is indicating. The collective is more likely to be smart when it isn't defining its own questions, when the goodness of an answer can be evaluated by a simple result, such as a single numeric value, and when the information system which informs the collective is filtered by a quality control mechanism that relies, and here he divulges his secret thesis, by individuals to a high degree. And indeed, the more you read this article, the more it reminds you of an antique print-centered authority model where there's a single individual author responsible for the page in the background. When you see the context in which something was written and you know who the author was beyond just a name, you learn so much more than when you find the same text placed in the anonymous, faux authoritative, anti-contextual group of the Wikipedia. The question isn't just one of authentication and accountability, though those are important, but something more subtle. A voice should be sensed as a whole. So on the one hand, the authority should be everyone. On the other hand, no, that's the way to either fascism or Maoism. The authority should be the individual author. How to split the difference? What would be a sensible, a better policy that could include both views or negotiate between those two views to foment a better policing or a better policy for knowledge on Web 2.0? That's my question here today. The specific form of it for our conference, of course, is what is the best way to police the relationship between scholarly knowledge and Web 2.0? Having learned my lesson with that policy statement that I created for appropriate use of Wikipedia, I would like from now on in the future not to start with pragmatic solutions that leave a bad taste in the mouth, because they are inevitably contradictory. I would like to suggest that the first and most important thing is to found a policy in this new age of knowledge of ours upon philosophically legitimate and valid ground. We need to get our grounding straight first and then worry about the pragmatic solutions later here. And the first step, therefore, I think, is to rephrase the question in a certain way. Not what is the best way to police that relationship, best indicating a kind of absolutist framework where there might be one absolute solution, but instead, what I would like to call, and my goal is not relativism, not by any means, but instead a kind of a philosophical resonance to the word here. What might be instead of the best policy for Knowledge 2.0? A good policy for Web 2.0. Good, with the classical resonance of, say, Plato talking about the good, or the classical philosophers talking about the good life. I think the appropriate way to start upon a philosophically sound policy for knowledge in our new era is to ask what is a good policy for governing the relationship of scholarly knowledge to Web 2.0. So here an important distinction needs to be made. What I'm against is what I would like to call good enough knowledge. What the economists in technical language call satisficing knowledge rather than satisfying knowledge. Brief lesson in satisficing theory. I am pretty much a satisficing consumer, which is the reason that my wife will no longer allow me out of the house to shop for major appliances by myself. It washes clothes, good enough. That's a satisficing consumer. That's why as graduate school I took the first apartment that I found and ended up in the murder capital of Palo Alto. It's got 4 walls, that's fine. The illusion, Gerald Lanier says, and his statement and vocabulary is echoed often in discussions of Web 2.0. The illusion that what we already have is close to good enough, it's alive and will fix itself, is the most dangerous illusion of all. And so what I mean by good enough knowledge is the perspective of my undergraduate students who, when given an assignment, goes up to Wikipedia, finds the first 1 or 2 articles, and that's good enough. There's an infinity of information out there. No one can read it all, so let's just grab what will work for the current assignment and make it do. That's good enough knowledge. I think of that as the Rube Goldberg model of knowledge. So as long as you know the exact thing you want the knowledge to do, as long as all your assumptions are right, as long as the wind doesn't blow a little too hard, then it will work, and your knowledge model will survive. But if you change a single assumption or contextual variant or factor in the background, you'll find that your model knowledge is, your knowledge model is not robust enough and will break down. Presume, for example, that I'm not speaking to a group of well-educated, primarily middle-class educators here, but instead to a group of blue-collar workers in Detroit. How might that illusion I made a moment ago to Plato have gone over? How might I adapt my knowledge discourse in order to accommodate that group of others? How might I make my knowledge more robust in order to include things that I had not thought about in my little local necessity for doing something right at the moment here? This translates very easily into what they call mashup knowledge on the web today. As you may know, a mashup is, for example, this is the programmable web register of most of the known mashups now. A mashup is what happens when you take a repository of knowledge on the web, such as Google Maps, that opens itself up for others to use, and then write a program that does nothing more than, like the BBC goes in and raids that repository for a specific local purpose with no cognizance of the larger context or use of the resource in the background. So this is the BBC News Google Maps mashup using the Google resource here, which worries about nothing more than this local intersection, like a Rube Goldberg machine, of what works for the purpose for this particular cluster of news stories today here. And it's something like the executive dashboard vision of knowledge today as well. If you're an executive these days, one of the things you will die for is what they call an executive dashboard, which sits in your laptop or on your desktop screen and presumes to give you a functioning, real-time vision of what's happening with sales figures right at the moment across all the branches of your network here. You don't need to know about the employees, you just need to know about those particular factors that's good enough for your specific purposes, which are the local quarterly figures and monthly figures or weekly figures here. By contrast, I think we can start on the notion, what I would like to call the philosophy of good knowledge, by pulling out this text from Plato's Theorist, which periodically I keep in my back pocket and take out and read to myself whenever I find myself too intoxicated by new media. This is Plato's well-known critique of the new media of his time, writing. In the words of Socrates, in a little myth about the invention of writing, famous, the Egyptian king replied to Thuth, the inventor of writing, "O most ingenious Thuth, the parent or inventor of an art is not always the best judge of the utility or inutility of his own inventions, the users of them. This discovery of yours, writing, will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific, that is the medicine, which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminiscence. You give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things and will learn nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing." This last clause struck me so forcibly when I was thinking about Wikipedia. I'll read it again. "They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing." The critique of new media is as old as the romance of new media itself here. So what was the classical notion of knowledge? Not that I think it can survive intact in the same form today, but it's useful to go back to that paradigmatic notion of a good knowledge. It might be visualized something like this: a single gathered dot of information that forms you as a person and as a consciousness here. Knowledge out there is worth nothing from the Platonic perspective unless it is ingathered and informed in such a way that it is ready to hand, to be used, for example, in a dialogic contest, as you need. Unless it is in you, rather than outsource that written text in there, it is not truly knowledge at all. Unpacked a little bit and graphed over a polar coordinate system, you realize that gathered informed knowledge paradigm is what amounts to the classical notion of an encyclopedia, which etymologically goes back to the Greek notion of an encyclical or round of knowledges, learnings, and discourses, which you would need to be, and the usage still survives in relic form today, to become a well-rounded individual. In our liberal arts curriculum today, I think we still hold on to the vestigial notion that true education, true knowledge, requires one to be well-rounded, to have that full circle of knowledge ingathered in some symmetrical form in a way that makes sense inside ourselves here. Or graphed over a linear axis system as opposed to a polar coordinate system. This is the kind of thinking that powers classical linear thought, as it's called, the ability to move in linear, logical fashion from one step to another. I've been writing the essay recently titled, "When Was Linearity?" Become interested in the issue of, in new media days today, the cliche is that we've lost the talent for linear thought. There were all lateral thinkers, hypertextual thinkers, and so on. And I became interested in the issue of, when did linear thought actually apply? Because you can go back as far as the 17th century and find complaints about the loss of linear thought here, about the information overload, about browsing, about scanning, and so on. So I haven't yet found the answer to when linear thought actually happened. The main thought I have to offer is that the classical mode of knowledge negotiated between knowledge of the outside world, of others, of otherness, and knowledge of oneself. Knowing otherness and knowing thyself are part of the same reciprocal. Sir Philip Sidney called it architectonic an act of knowledge, a knowledge of thyself, not in thyself specifically, but in the politic function as well, conscious of the external world. You should know otherness, but it has no bearing and no relevance and no meaning unless it is informed architectonically within yourself. And reciprocally, your ability to act as a social agent is nothing unless it comes out of a gathered, informed center within yourself, like Socrates speaking outwards to other people. I won't try to bring the philosophical picture all the way through the centuries. It's very easy, for example, to see that if you map it over a Cartesian grid here, that it's recognizably the model of knowledge in the Enlightenment, or the New Classical Era, as we call it. Things get a little bit complicated when we move toward the beginning of the 20th century, toward the fractioning and the dispersion of what Habermas called the life world. And before you know it, we end up today with a topography of knowledge that looks not like a centered point, nor like a circle, but something like this, which is a network diagram, where the knowledge of otherness is what we call network knowledge today, irreducible to a single gathered point, irreducible even to a round or encyclical form of knowledge, but instead an open-ended lateral dispersion with no horizon in sight. And where as well, that outward or lateral dispersion of knowledge can never be ingathered into a single point, well, self-knowledge, but where self-knowledge is replaced with, I like to call it my knowledge or I knowledge, as on the MySpace or Facebook page, which is a very interesting seat of consciousness here. A consciousness of self, a cogito, which in its sidebar is correlatively conscious of all the friends out there in an open-ended network that you don't fully control. There are some people with, 15,000 friends. I know someone who has an exercise, who's a sociologist doing research, elected as his friend, everyone who had the name John that he shared. What kind of negotiation between network knowledge and my knowledge today could reproduce something like the sanction, something like the robustness of good knowledge in the past? It's different from good enough knowledge. We like to think that network knowledge might have something like that orbicular topography of encyclical knowledge. This is my colleague and friend Warren Sachs' program designed to visualize what's happening in real-time chats in online communities called agnostics. And just see that he's a classicist at heart. He's trying to imagine this network communication as something like an encyclical round, as if in a round table or seminar discussion, when it really isn't here. When instead, the discussion looks more like this. This is a social network theorist diagram of what happens on the web here. When at the most, you can draw these temporary and ad hoc circles around clusters of dynamic, mutating, reforming groups of actors and agents and discussants here, all of whom are interested in each other only for the good enough ad hoc purpose of the moment here. How do we negotiate between the knowledge of network others and of our own sensibilities and needs in a world like this to reproduce something like the stability, the authority of old-time classical knowledge? That is the question we have to solve. I have only to conclude today with a I always have trouble with this word. I would be lying if I said that I was actually a classicist here. Prolegomena, okay, I've got the accent right here. I have only to offer a preface here to a policy that would be useful and satisfying for Knowledge 2.0, followed by a proposal to give you at least a gist of how such a policy might be implemented. I think that preparatory work toward an adequate policy of knowledge in the world of Web 2.0 will require us rigorously to think both the distinction and the overlap between our sanctioned models of academic knowledge today and Web 2.0 models of knowledge. So contrast, first of all. Academic knowledge, for example, is expertise-driven. Web 2.0 knowledge is what they call reputation-driven, as in the sphere of reputation metrics and other technologies designed to measure how often your page is cited by others. Academic knowledge is moderately stratified, senior professors, associate professors, assistants, graduate students, and so on down the chain. Web 2.0 is moderately flat, although there are some plateaus of administrators, bureaucrats, and others within that realm. Academic knowledge is disciplinary. We are the English subject center here. Web 2.0 doesn't care about disciplines much at all. I don't care whether you're an English professor or a French professor or a historian, just tell me when the French Revolution started. Web 2.0 attitude. Academic knowledge, at least in the humanities, is still by and large individualistic in its production model. I used to have a sign on my office door that read, "Go away, I'm writing." Web 2.0 from the start is collective and collaborative. Academic knowledge is slow. Took me 10 years to write my last book. Okay, I'm slower than most here. And if it weren't slow on the part of the author, him or herself, we have mechanisms to ensure that's even slower. They're called peer review, they're called tenure review, and so on. Web 2.0 knowledge is quick. Although that's not to say it's not without its own review processes. They come after the fact. You fool, that's a mistake. A review after the fact, leading to changes in feedback and so on here. Academic knowledge, however, is open to open source and open access. And so too, Web 2.0 is friendly to open source and open access. So you see that I've drawn my contrast down to a point finally of convergence. There is some overlap as well. And indeed, when you go back through the list, the more you think rigorously about this contrast that I've been drawing, the more you realize the contrast is merely the opening of a negotiation or dialogue for how a compromise might be realized in the future that brings out the best of each other's paradigm of knowledge. So expertise-driven, are we really as academics? Or have we always also had an invisible reputation system under the surface which has just not been declared enough? Could we learn something about the way Web 2.0 makes reputation metrics explicit that would help augment and complement the way we actually do things in the academy? Stratified? Yes, we are in the academy, but certainly we're not as stratified as a military organization or as a company would be. Are there ways that we can understand what we do in committee meetings and classrooms in a non-stratified way better if we go to Web 2.0 to see how they are explicitly framing the rules for collaborative kinds of activities? We're certainly disciplinary, but we're told these days, and many of us tell ourselves, that we are interdisciplinary as well here. That's certainly an overlap or compromise in the making. We're individualistic, except when we're not. Except when we're collaborating with co-editors, with our students, with others to make projects. We're slow, except when that tenure clock comes up, and then boy, are we quick. Are there ways that we can learn to be even quicker? To publish, for example, as Mackenzie Wark has done, not so much monographs done 3 or 4 years at a time, but paragraph by paragraph, each up for immediate review and so on. There's lots of room for negotiation, dialogue, and compromise toward a hybrid model of knowledge here that might be policed or authorized or legitimated by both sets of standards in some interesting and fertile mix. And though I do not have time for it here, I might point out that both the Academy and Web 2.0 probably need to look at what's not yet on the radar scope in the discourses of either, and that is the team-based model that the corporate world has instituted to create a middle ground between the authority of the individual author and the authority of the collective masses out there. After all, these editors, programmers, and designers who are very technically sophisticated that I indicated earlier, the closest analogy in the corporate world would be to a small unit team of one sort or another, say 6 to 10 people or so, each with a highly specialized competence complementary to each other. I'll conclude with a short proposal, and I apologize that I cannot give you the context or even any of the particulars for this, but this will give you an indication of how a properly grounded policy toward Web 2.0 that hybridizes between academic paradigms and Web 2.0 paradigms might be implemented. Let's imagine that we can use what I call social markup, social data mining, social visualization, and policing by mashup, or policing by many, to authorize knowledge 2.0, to give it its proper authority. Here's the chocolate page on Wikipedia, which, if you don't know, has been, for some reason, the victim of long-standing edit wars, revert wars, and vandalism. People care passionately about their chocolate here. If you look very carefully, there's this subtle little hint on Wikipedia of the little lock icon, being this page is protected from editing at the moment. It has been the ground of too many wars here. By my lights, the page should light up in pink, and there should be a pop-up message saying that, and this is possible technologically, by assessing the editing patterns in the data, we have found that this page is unreliable for these particular purposes, It has a flow visualization paradigm which indicates that there have been editing wars in the background. The key authors here have been implicated in other edit wars on the site, and so on and so forth here. It ought to be possible, in other words, to create technologies that allow for pages to be authorized in ways that they are visible to the user here. And just as importantly, if you allow me just one or two slides to close with, that kind of filtering function should be able to be created by anybody, not just by the creators of Wikipedia itself. So that the classroom, the school, the religion, the club, community organization can create its own knowledge filters that do nothing more than transport to the web what those organizations are already in the business of doing and are socially sanctioned to do, which is to create authoritative models of knowledge for their local purposes and their local community. There's no better way of closing than to show you at the end that the original informer, let us call it, or whistleblower, of the fact that too many of the students in my class were using Wikipedia was actually a student who said, "Professor, I'm not proud of the way I and my other peers have been acting here. Can you do something about it? I would like to create a technology of the future and a policy that backs it up, in which local communities of usage can create their own standards for what is authorized use of the internet." I'll stop there.